The embers in the great kitchen hearth had long died down to a dull, ash-choked orange, casting long, distorted shadows across the scrubbed stone floor. The air in the servants' quarters tasted faintly of lye soap, stale bread crusts, and the sharp, metallic draught creeping beneath the heavy oak door. Lyra Vance moved through the darkness with the absolute precision of a phantom. She placed her thin leather boots only on the solid, even flagstones, avoiding the loose mortar that would betray her weight with a single scrape. Her breathing was measured, slow and deliberate, drawn in shallow sips to keep her chest from expanding too far against the tight lacing of her worn woolen bodice. Pressed firmly into the center of her right palm was her late mother's tarnished brass key. The metal was freezing, biting into her skin, yet she refused to loosen her grip. It carried the physical weight of the ancestral library, the only piece of her lineage that had not yet been swallowed by Garrick gambling debts. The jagged teeth of the key pressed against her lifeline, a sharp reminder of exactly what she stood to lose before dawn. Near the dying fire, a low, uneven breath broke the absolute quiet of the room. Nellie Cole had fallen asleep in a rickety wooden chair, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle against the stone mantel. A spilled mending basket rested at the kitchen maid's feet, spools of coarse thread scattered across the hearth rug. The harsh northern winter was already seeping through the cracks in the stone walls, and the thin, frayed blanket draped over Nellie's shoulders was actively slipping, inching closer to the stone floor with every exhaled breath. Lyra stopped, her gaze fixed on the falling fabric. She was in a desperate hurry. The outer guards changed their patrol shifts at exactly midnight, leaving a narrow, 3-minute window where the eastern courtyard remained entirely unobserved. Pausing now defied every tactical calculation she had made over the last 4 hours. Every wasted second increased the risk of discovery. She did not step toward the exit. Instead, Lyra turned her body, crossing the uneven stones with silent, deliberate steps until she stood beside the sleeping woman. She reached out, her fingers brushing the coarse grey wool. Moving with agonizing care, Lyra caught the edge of the blanket before it could hit the floor. She lifted it, pulling the heavy fabric up and over Nellie's narrow shoulders, tucking the corners firmly beneath her arms to seal out the freezing draught. Nellie shifted in the chair, her brow furrowing slightly, before she let out a soft sigh and leaned deeper into the restored warmth. Lyra withdrew her hand immediately. She did not wait for the maid to settle completely. The act of preservation was finished. Lyra pivoted on her heel, crossed the remaining distance to the servants' exit, and slipped through the heavy oak door, letting it click shut behind her without a single sound. The northern winter hit her the moment she stepped into the outer courtyard. The air did not merely blow. It bit into her exposed skin with the sharpness of cold iron. It smelled of deep ozone, dead pine, and the damp earth of the sovereign estate. Lyra pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her neck, ignoring the violent shudder that tore through her shoulders. She kept her chin lowered, stepping off the exposed gravel path and moving into the dense ink-black shadows cast by the towering cypress trees. Above her, the full moon hung in the cloudless sky like a polished silver coin, illuminating the vast, manicured grounds of the fortress. Lyra navigated the perimeter with mechanical efficiency. She tracked the distant rhythmic crunch of the sentry's boots on the northern parapet, using the sound to measure her own pace. She moved only when the wind howled loudly enough to cover the rustle of her skirts, slipping from the cover of one massive tree trunk to the next entirely invisible to the men who believed they controlled the night. Her destination stood at the very edge of the neglected eastern gardens. The abandoned royal glasshouse loomed in the darkness, a skeletal monument of rusted iron ribs and shattered glass. Decades of harsh storms and sovereign indifference had stripped the structure of its former glory, leaving it isolated and largely forgotten by the court. Under the stark, bone-white light of the moon, the ruin possessed a devastating, quiet majesty. Lyra approached the grand entrance, her boots making no sound on the moss-covered stone steps. The heavy double doors were framed by tall panes of glass, though several were jaggedly broken, offering open wounds to the freezing wind. Where the glass remained intact, the winter cold had seized the surface, building thick, intricate layers of frost. The ice had patterned the panes like delicate silver lace, creeping across the transparent surface in sharp, fractal webs. She stood before the door, the heavy object still clutched tightly in her fist, but she did not immediately reach for the heavy iron lock. Lyra raised her free hand, her cracked, pale knuckles illuminated in the moonlight. Not a desperate fugitive, but a woman standing in a garden, observing the ice. Finally, Lyra lowered her hand. The cold had seeped deep into her joints, steadying her trembling fingers. She stepped forward and slid the brass metal into the rusted keyhole. The internal tumblers fought her for a moment, stiff from years of disuse, before giving way with a deep, echoing clack. Lyra pushed her weight against the iron frame. The door groaned open, spilling the scent of dry soil and dead roses into the night, and she stepped forward to be swallowed by the dark. Inside, the stone ledge was unforgiving, holding the deep freeze of the northern winter, long after the sun had died. Lyra Vance sat perfectly upright, refusing to let the bitter chill force her shoulders into a slump. Across her knees rested the thick, unyielding bulk of the leather ledger. The moonlight filtered through the shattered canopy of the ruined glasshouse, casting fractured beams of silver over the cracked binding. She pressed her bare fingers against the brass clasp. The metal bit into her skin like ice, but she unfastened it with a quiet, deliberate click. The heavy parchment pages rustled dryly as she laid the book open. A fine layer of pale dust coated the inner gutter of the spine, accumulated from months of neglect in her stepfather's locked study. Leaning forward, she blew the dust away. The soft exhalation plumed white in the freezing air, drifting upward toward the broken glass above. Beneath the cleared surface, the page revealed two entirely different histories, written in overlapping ink. The first was the meticulous, elegant script of her mother, Elena. The older woman had catalogued the ancestral library with the precision of a jeweler measuring gems, noting the condition of every binding, the exact shelf placement, and the historical weight of the municipal land grant laws housed within their walls. Layered brutally over those elegant lines were the vulgar additions of Garrick. Heavy, careless strokes of cheap charcoal scored through centuries of heritage. Tally marks tracked the gambler's reckless bets, reducing ancient cartography and sovereign treaties to mere currency. He had traded original vellum maps of the northern territories, documents sealed with the silver wax of ancient pack elders, for a few hours at the wagering tables. He had bartered away thick, brass-cornered treatises on sovereign law just to cover debts accrued in the capital's lowest taverns. Lyra did not read the titles of the crossed-out volumes. To read them, to see the specific medical folios and early pack registries that were gone forever, would shatter her fragile quiet. Instead, she let her gaze blur past the financial ruin, searching the extreme edges of the parchment. Her mother had drawn tiny, intricate vines and botanical notations along the margins, framing the rigid text with quiet life. Lyra rested her thumb exactly over a cluster of these hand-drawn leaves. She did not trace the letters. She focused solely on the dried ink of the vines, pressing the pad of her thumb against the slight indentation the quill had left in the thick paper. She sought the ghost of the older woman's pulse in the pressed fibers, anchoring herself to the physical memory of a careful hand rather than the vast, unquantifiable absence of her legacy. The cold radiating from the stone ledge began to numb her legs through the thin wool of her skirt. Her bare fingertips, pressing against the heavy pages, turned a pale, bloodless white, yet she did not shift her weight to seek warmth. The temperature dropped further, turning the ambient air brittle. Her vision swam as the sharp lines of ink began to dissolve in the watery light. The first tear spilled over her lower lid. It arrived without a gasp, without a shudder, entirely disconnected from the loud, messy mechanics of an ordinary breakdown. She sat completely still, allowing the liquid to trace a slow, unimpeded path down her pale cheek. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. Even here, completely alone in the ruins of the royal estate, that discipline held firm. The absolute silence of the glass house swallowed the quiet descent of the water. A single drop caught in the thick lashes of her left eye, pooling heavily in the bitter draught. The air was so freezing that the tiny bead of moisture began to crystallize, hardening into a sharp, frozen sliver of ice. Lyra did not raise a hand to wipe it away. She let it stay, allowing the paralyzing cold to preserve the physical weight of the loss, transforming a momentary drop into a hard, unyielding monument. She breathed shallowly, letting the frost claim the edges of her vision. Beyond the shattered glass walls, 50 yards across the frost-choked soil, the cypress grove stood in absolute blackness. Alpha King Darius Vaughan stood perfectly motionless within that heavy shade. Darius Vaughan occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. The sovereign had tracked the solitary figure from the outer courtyard, expecting to intercept a trespassing scout or a thief. Instead, he found a woman holding an archive record as if it were a fragile rib cage. He watched the moonlight catch the glint of the frozen tear on her eyelash. In the grand halls of the capital, his court was a theatre of desperate voices, loud demands, and calculated flattery. When nobles wept in his presence, they did so with an eye on the audience, tearing their velvet garments, and wailing their velvet garments and wailing for the benefit of the gallery to ensure their sorrow was measured for political currency. But the woman on the ledge offered no performance. She believed herself to be completely unseen, yet she maintained a profound, unbroken dignity. Her shoulders remained rigidly straight despite the obvious cold. She made no sound to invite intervention, no dramatic collapse onto the frozen earth, no loud pleas directed at the indifferent moon. Her grief was entirely contained, folded inward like a map locked away in a dark drawer. The sheer control of her stillness struck him with the force of a physical blow. Her quiet dignity commanded the ruined garden more absolutely than any royal decree he had ever issued. Darius felt a strange, heavy pressure settle in his chest. It was not pity. Pity was a useless emotion, a coin given by the comfortable to the unfortunate. What he felt was closer to recognition. He recognized the heavy, terrible discipline required to hold oneself together when the foundation had been ripped away. A dry pine branch hovered mere inches from his shoulder, brittle with ice. A single misstep would snap it, sending a loud crack echoing through the hollow glasshouse ruins. To prevent the heavy velvet of his cloak from rustling against the bark, the Alpha King deliberately slowed his own physical rhythm. He kept his heavy boots planted firmly in the freezing soil, unwilling to step forward and shatter the absolute sanctity of her endurance. He watched the rise and fall of her thin shoulders, timing his inhalations to match her slow, shallow gasps. When she took a trembling breath of the freezing air, he drew breath. When she exhaled, releasing a faint plume of white vapor into the dark, he did the same. The temperature continued to drop, the frost thickening along the edges of the shattered glass panes like silver lace. Darius knew the limits of a human or omega body in this specific northern cold. If she remained on that stone ledge much longer, The damp chill of the ruined masonry would seep into her bones, slowing her blood and dulling her mind. He could not allow her to freeze, nor could he leave her to carry that heavy, suffocating silence alone. Moving with the precise, calculated grace of a sovereign predator, Darius stepped forward. He did not rush. A sudden appearance from the tree line would trigger an immediate survival response, and he had no desire to see that rigid posture shatter into blind panic. Before his heavy boots could crunch against the frost-heaved gravel of the garden pathway, he stopped entirely. He remained near the edge of the moonlight, ensuring his towering silhouette was visible, but not immediately imposing upon her physical space. Then he cleared his throat. It was a low, measured sound, just loud enough to break the ambient quiet of the winter night without carrying the harsh, commanding edge of a royal decree. The reaction was instantaneous. The woman on the ledge stopped breathing. For a fraction of a second, absolute stillness overtook her, the stillness of a compass needle finding north under sudden magnetic pressure. Most women of the court, caught weeping in the ruins past midnight, would have scrambled backward, dropped their belongings, or let out a sharp cry of alarm. Many would have immediately dropped their gaze to the frozen dirt, assuming the subservient crouch expected of the lower ranks when caught off guard by a larger shadow. She did none of these things. Instead, her hands moved with deliberate, terrifying calm. She closed the thick leather book, running her thumb over the brass clasp to ensure it was securely fastened. Only then did she turn her head. She did not scramble away from the edge of the stone. Slowly, she stood up. The threadbare shawl slipped slightly from her left shoulder, but she caught it. She could not possibly know his identity yet, given the heavy gloom obscuring his face and the complete lack of a royal entourage. To her, he was merely a massive, unknown male trespassing in an abandoned garden at midnight. Yet she refused to look defensive. She did not raise her hands to shield her face, nor did she take a single step backward into the darker recesses of the glass house. She simply stood her ground, waiting for the intruder to declare his intent. She guarded her physical space and her heavy book with the quiet authority of someone who had already lost too much to be intimidated by a mere shadow. Darius felt the muscles in his jaw tighten, a quiet pulse of profound respect settling in his veins. He had expected to find a fragile creature in need of rescue. Instead, he had found a fortress. The sound of boots against the frost-covered stone was unhurried, measured with the deliberate weight of a man who possessed no fear of the dark. Lyra's breath stopped, but her posture locked into absolute stillness as she stood facing him, her cold fingers tightening imperceptibly around the binding of the leather ledger. The shadows of the giant cypress trees parted, and the towering silhouette of the Alpha King materialized in the silver light of the moon. Darius Vaughan stopped exactly 3 paces away from her. It was a highly calculated distance. Close enough to offer assistance, yet far enough to ensure she did not feel cornered against the shattered glass walls of the ruin. He did not speak immediately. He simply looked at her, his gaze sweeping over the thin, threadbare shawl that offered absolutely no defense against the lethal northern winter. He registered the fine tremors shaking her shoulders and the pale, bloodless shade of her knuckles. Silence stretched between them, thick and expectant, but it was not heavy with threat. He held the quiet with deliberate confidence, entirely free from the restless urge to vocalize his presence. Without uttering a single word of command or hollow comfort, the sovereign raised his hands to his own shoulders. The velvet cloak he wore was immense, a heavy expanse of midnight fabric lined with thick, insulating northern fur. His fingers found the ornate golden clasp at his throat. He unfastened it with slow, mechanical precision. Lyra watched him, her mind rapidly assessing the geometry of the space, calculating the impossibility of this encounter. the king of the Winter Fortress was standing in a ruined glasshouse at midnight, shedding his outer layer for a woman he did not know. Darius took one single step forward. The movement was entirely devoid of suddenness. He lifted the massive garment and lowered it gently over her shivering frame. The action was purely utilitarian, stripped of any possessive undertone or predatory grace. It was the pragmatic response of a ruler neutralizing an immediate physical danger. As the fabric settled over her, he released the cloak's golden clasp with careful precision, so the heavy metal did not accidentally graze her collarbone. His bare hands never once brushed against her skin. The moment the weight of the material anchored her to the stone, the man stepped back. He retreated precisely to his previous position, restoring the invisible boundary he had briefly crossed. He did not hover. He did not lean down to inspect the tears rapidly drying on her cheeks. He simply stood in the freezing air, his broad shoulders braced against the wind, waiting for the ambient warmth of the garment to take effect. For a fraction of a second, Lyra remained perfectly rigid beneath the sudden, overwhelming weight. The velvet cloak felt like a physical fortress dropping over her fragile defenses. It was impossibly heavy, lined with a dense fur that trapped the residual heat of the Alpha's body. Slowly, her numb fingers uncurled from the ledger. She reached up, her cracked, ink-stained hands gripping the thick edges of the fabric. She pulled the garment tightly around her, drawing the material across her chest in a seamless, practical motion. She did not attempt a foolish, prideful refusal of the offering. To reject necessary warmth in a dying winter garden was not dignity. It was slow suicide. She was, above all things, a survivor who understood the value of a resource. As the heavy folds enclosed her, the sensory shift was absolute. The distinct scent of cedar and fresh winter rain clung deeply to the fabric, instantly overriding the sharp, sterile odor of dead pine and frost that permeated the ruin. It was a grounded, ancient smell, carrying the atmospheric pressure of the deep woods rather than the cloying perfumes of the royal court. The scent was undeniably powerful, yet it carried no coercive alpha command. It simply existed, offering shelter to anyone standing within its radius. She buried her cold chin slightly into the dark fur collar, letting out a long, visible puff of warm breath that slowly dissipated into the freezing air. The white vapor plumed and vanished, leaving behind a profound quiet. The soft fur grazed the delicate skin of her jaw, a shocking, luxurious contrast to the biting wind she had endured for the past hour. The violent, uncontrollable shivering that had racked her bones began to subside, replaced by a slow, measured calibration of her internal temperature. She watched him from the safety of the dark velvet, her dark eyes tracking his unreadable expression. He had not asked for her name. He had not demanded an explanation for her presence in a restricted zone, nor had he interrogated her about the quiet weeping he had undoubtedly witnessed. Most men of his rank would have immediately demanded compliance or offered unwanted, pitying touches to assert their dominance over a vulnerable subject. Darius did neither. He remained a silent sentinel against the backdrop of the shattered glass panes, giving her the rarest commodity in the entire sovereign keep. The time to recover her composure without an audience demanding a performance. The cold stone ledge beneath her no longer felt like an execution block. Shielded by the cedar-scented fabric, Lyra let her heartbeat slow. The terrifying vulnerability of her grief quietly sealed away beneath the heavy fur. The wind shifted through the broken glass panes overhead, sending a fine dusting of snow drifting down into the ruined garden. It settled on the dead vines and the cracked marble of the empty fountain. Darius did not take another step toward her. He understood the physical mechanics of intimidation better than any man in the Northern Territories, acutely aware of how a sovereign's sheer size could easily be misread as a threat in the isolated dark. Instead, He broke his gaze away from her shivering form and looked toward a long, curved stone bench positioned near the edge of the terrace. The marble was heavily coated in silver rime, untouched by human warmth for years. Darius walked over to it, the heavy soles of his boots crunching softly, predictably, against the frost-heaved gravel. He made no sudden movements. When he reached the bench, he did not claim the center seat. Using his gloved hand, he deliberately dusted off a small patch of ice at the absolute furthest edge of the stone. Crystals scattered into the darkness, catching the moonlight like crushed glass. He sat down slowly, resting his forearms on his knees, deliberately reducing his towering height to a more approachable, grounded level. Once settled, he gestured faintly toward the empty expanse of stone on the opposite end of the bench. It was a quiet, geometric proof that he had no intention of crowding her, establishing a tangible boundary of safety. The king allowed the profound quiet of the glasshouse to settle between them, entirely free from the restless urge to vocalize his presence. He watched the way she held the velvet cloak around herself, not as a luxury, but as a tactical shield against the biting northern wind. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, measured murmur that barely disturbed the freezing air. "It is a bitter night to be wandering the outer estates without a lantern," he said, his tone conversational, entirely devoid of royal command. His eyes shifted from her pale face to the heavy object she held rigidly against her stomach. "And that is a very particular choice of companion for the cold. One does not usually bring a municipal record book into the ruins unless they are searching for something buried or hiding something lost." He did not demand her name. He did not order her to explain her tears or her presence in his private gardens. He merely offered an observation, leaving the door wide open for her to either answer or walk away into the trees. The physical geography of their seating arrangement, the vast, empty stretch of frosted marble acting as a neutral zone, spoke louder than any promise of safety. He was not a predator cornering a stray in the night. He was a sovereign, offering an audience without the suffocating pressure of his court. Lyra remained standing near the frozen vines for a long moment, her breathing slowing as the heavy scent of cedar and winter rain from his cloak enveloped her. She analyzed the distance he had established. It was a calculated respect, a rare currency in a hierarchy that usually dealt only in brute dominance. Slowly, she stepped out of the deepest shadows and moved toward the opposite end of the stone bench. She did not sit, preferring the tactical advantage of staying on her feet, but she closed the distance just enough to be heard over the rattling iron frames of the glass house. She looked down at the thick book resting against her forearms. The leather ledger was freezing to the touch, its brass-capped corners biting sharply into her palms. Her right thumb found the embossed family crest stamped into the spine, a hawk perched atop an open tome. She began to trace the worn ridges of the old leather. The motion was small, rhythmic, and intensely disciplined. Beneath the shadow of the velvet hood, her knuckles were bone-white, betraying the immense, crushing physical pressure she was applying to the binding. Yet, when she finally answered him, her voice was perfectly steady, meticulously stripped of any theatrical sorrow. "I am not searching and I am not hiding," she said quietly, her words forming a thin cloud of vapor in the frigid air. "I am Lyra Vance." Darius offered a slight nod, recognizing the surname immediately. The Vance lineage was ancient, a quiet bloodline composed of scholars and archivists who had maintained the northern municipal records long before the current fortress walls were erected. "I am here," Lyra continued, her thumb still mapping the perimeter of the crest with mechanical precision, "because I am mourning a death that has not yet finished happening." She did not look at the king, keeping her eyes fixed on the frost-covered gravel at the toes of her boots. "Tomorrow at dawn, my mother's ancestral library will be permanently seized. The collection contains 3 centuries of territorial cartography, unbroken bloodline registries, and original land grant deeds. It was my mother's life's work, maintained with flawless accuracy. Now, it is being forcibly transferred to cover a reckless wager that does not belong to me. Her thumb stopped moving. She pressed her hand flat against the cold leather cover, as if trying to shield the intricate ledgers inside from the harshness of the world. My stepfather, Garrick Thane, signed a forfeiture clause using the library as collateral for his debts. It is a fraudulent claim that violates the old municipal laws, but he has the council's ear, and I have only this ledger. The tension in her arms was absolute, a rigid containment of a grief that threatened to tear her apart from the inside. They are not just taking parchment and ink, Your Majesty. They are taking the only documentary proof that my family ever existed, and I am standing here in the dark because I am entirely powerless to stop the ink from drying on his transfer deed. She waited for the king to offer a hollow platitude, or worse, to remind her that administrative disputes were beneath his midnight concern. But Darius remained perfectly still on the far end of the bench, his sharp gaze fixed on the white-knuckled grip she maintained on the leather ledger. He did not offer empty pity. Instead, he observed the unyielding core of a woman who refused to shatter, calculating the precise legal weight of the injustice she had just placed before him. The cold inside the ruined glass house seemed to thicken, pressing against the shattered panes, with a low whistling sound that echoed off the broken marble tiles. Under the immense weight of the velvet cloak, her shivering had finally begun to subside, replaced by the meticulous, calculating focus she had always utilized to survive her stepfather's chaotic ruin. Garrick Thane is a man who treats our heritage as currency, Lyra said. Her voice was barely louder than the wind, yet it was completely devoid of the tremor that had haunted her tears moments before. He wagered the last of our estate's liquid assets in the southern betting parlors 3 months ago. When the silver ran dry, he desperately needed collateral to satisfy the debt holders. She opened the ledger. The moonlight filtering through the frost-laced glass illuminated the dense, neat columns of black ink, though she did not truly need the light to read them. She had memorized every line, every date, every numerical betrayal. The parchment was stiff with the cold, but she turned the page with absolute care. He drafted a forfeiture clause, she continued, her index finger resting beside a specific entry marked by a thin ribbon of dried linen. He surrendered the Vance ancestral library, thousands of volumes, municipal records, and generational botanical treatises as payment. He presented a signed writ to his creditors, claiming the estate was legally unencumbered and free to be traded. She did not look up at Darius. Her gaze remained fixed on the dried ink, her mind navigating the complex architecture of royal law she had studied in secret during the long, lonely hours in the archives. She refused to plead for his pity. Pity was a fragile, useless thing, easily given and easily revoked by powerful men. Instead, she appealed directly to the cold, undeniable structure of the law itself. "The forfeiture is entirely illegal," Lyra stated, her tone shifting seamlessly into the precise, measured cadence of a royal archivist. Under the Third Edict of the Northern Territories, specifically the 7th section regarding land grant statutes, Subclause 4 dictates the terms of ancestral property. It explicitly states that any transfer of a hereditary archive requires the witnessed blood seal of the direct matrilineal descendant. She traced a line of her own meticulous handwriting with a pale fingernail. Garrick forged my mother's signature on a subordinate collateral writ. He dated the document the 14th of November. But according to the royal carriage manifests and the border transit registry, both of which I manually copied into this ledger, he was residing in the capital on that exact date. The document was supposedly witnessed and sealed in the outer borderlands. It is physically, geographically impossible for the writ to be authentic. She laid the facts out between them like stones, forming a secure path across a treacherous, rushing river. She did not speak of her heartbreak over the stolen books, nor the sheer cruelty of a stepfather who would sell his late wife's soul to cover a reckless gambling loss. She offered only mathematics, geography, and statute. She had spent enough of her life learning that tears held no weight in a court of men. Ink, however, was permanent. The silence that followed her explanation was not the heavy, oppressive quiet of rejection or disbelief. It was the deliberate, measuring stillness of a sovereign evaluating a piece of extraordinary, irrefutable evidence. Darius did not offer a sudden, impulsive vow of violence against her stepfather. He did not growl, bare his teeth, nor did he attempt to close the physical distance between them on the frosted stone bench. He understood intrinsically that a woman who had built her defenses out of legal statutes did not need reckless anger. She needed structural validation. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly hum that seemed to resonate with the deep roots of the ancient cypress trees outside. "The sovereign court does not tolerate fraudulent contracts," Darius said quietly. He deliberately slowed the rhythm of his words. It was a highly tactical choice. A measured cadence meant to soothe the subtle underlying panic he could still scent beneath the sharp tang of winter pine and old paper. A forged blood seal on a royal writ is not a private family dispute, Lyra. It is a direct assault on the integrity of the Pact's municipal registries. If a man is permitted to forge a matrilineal deed without consequence, the entire system of inheritance within the capital is compromised. Lyra's breath caught faintly. She pulled the velvet cloak a fraction tighter around her shoulders, letting the ambient warmth of the heavy fur ground her against the biting cold of the stone ledge. The scent of cedar and winter rain enveloped her, a tactile reminder of his massive, unmovable presence guarding her flank. For months, she had carried the terrifying weight of Garrick's fraud entirely alone, anticipating the disastrous day the debt collectors would arrive to empty the library. She had prepared herself to be ignored, dismissed, or laughed out of the magistrate's office if she dared to present her handmade ledger. "You possess the copied carriage manifests," Darius continued, his gaze dropping briefly to the leather-bound book in her lap before returning respectfully to her face. "But do you know where the original forged deed is currently held?" "Garrick keeps it locked in his private box at the estate," she answered, her voice softening just a fraction as the tension in her neck eased. "He intends to present it to the council assessors tomorrow morning to finalize the transfer of the library." Darius gave a slow, measured nod. He did not ask her to hand over the ledger. He did not reach for it, nor did he lean into her space to inspect the ink. He respected the physical boundary she maintained, recognizing the book as her only remaining armor in a house that had stripped her of everything else. "Then we will review the documents formally," he told her, the deep resonance of his voice offering an absolute, unshakable guarantee. "Not here in the freezing dark. I will have the royal archivist open the vault. We will cross-reference your ledger against the original land-grant charters. If your stepfather presents a forged writ to the council tomorrow, he will not find a distracted clerk waiting to stamp his papers. He will find me." The gravel bit into the soles of her boots as she shifted her weight, the reality of his offer sinking into her bones, like warm water seeping into dry earth. He was not claiming her. He was not demanding her gratitude, nor was he enforcing his rank to make her feel small. He was offering her the full, terrifying machinery of sovereign justice, and he was doing it based entirely on the merit of her own meticulous labor. "You believe me," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could lock them firmly behind her usual restraint. It was not a question. It was the slow, cautious realization of a woman who had been invisible for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to be acknowledged. Darius looked at her, his expression solemn and unyielding in the silver light of the moon. "I believe the law," he answered softly, his eyes reflecting the frost on the glass. "And I believe the woman who had the intelligence to record the truth when everyone else chose to look away." The transition from the freezing glasshouse required absolute silence. Lyra followed the sovereign through the peripheral corridors of the winter fortress, the heavy hem of the velvet cloak brushing softly against the subterranean stone. Darius Vaughan did not take the grand staircases. He moved with the calculated efficiency of a predator navigating its own territory, choosing narrow passageways used primarily by the domestic staff. The social ruin of a midnight promenade with the Alpha King would have given her stepfather another weapon to use against her. Darius understood this without a single word being exchanged, stepping slightly ahead to block the freezing drafts that leaked through the arrow slits. The biting cold of the gardens gave way to the dense, dry warmth of the inner keep. They stopped before a reinforced iron-bound door deep within the western wing. Darius produced an iron key, turning it with a dull metallic scrape that echoed faintly in the empty hall. He pushed the heavy timber inward, stepping aside to gesture for her to enter first. The royal archive smelled of dry parchment, melted tallow, and the sharp bite of iron gall ink. It was a cavernous, windowless room, lined floor to ceiling with carved cedar shelves sagging under the weight of centuries of pack history. Near the dying embers of a massive stone hearth, an elderly man was slumped over a tilted reading desk. Thomas Thorne, the royal archivist, was deeply asleep, his chin resting precariously on a stack of bound provincial tax registries. The sound of the heavy oak door closing roused him. Thomas jerked awake, his wire-rimmed spectacles slipping dangerously down his nose. He squinted into the gloom, taking a long moment to register the towering silhouette standing in the doorway. As recognition struck, the blood drained completely from his weathered face. He scrambled to his feet, knocking a solid brass paperweight to the wooden floor with a heavy thud. His mouth opened wide, drawing in a massive breath to bellow the formal greeting required for the sovereign's arrival. Darius raised a single dark-gloved hand. It was not a threat, but a command of absolute silencing authority. He brought his index finger down in a sharp, definitive arc, waving the frantic archivist back into his seat. Thomas snapped his mouth shut, the grand introduction dying instantly in his throat. He swallowed hard, adjusting his spectacles with trembling fingers, and offered a deep, silent bow instead. The Alpha King did not need performative worship, and he clearly had no intention of alerting the rest of the keep to their midnight investigation. Lyra watched the exchange from the safety of the cloak, appreciating the rare relief of being guided by a man who controlled a room through sheer gravity rather than volume. Thomas scurried to the perimeter of the room, lighting a fresh taper from the hearth embers and bringing it to the central oak reading table. The single beeswax candle cast a warm, flickering amber light across the deeply scarred wood. At a low private murmur from Darius, the old man retreated to the secured iron vaults at the back of the archive. He returned minutes later, carrying a wide, flat wooden box, his posture hunched with protective caution. He unlatched the brass hinges with a sharp click, revealing the ancient municipal royal charters. They were the foundational laws of the northern pack territories, drafted on thick, cured sheepskin vellum that had yellowed to the color of old bone over the centuries. Lyra stepped directly into the ring of candlelight. She unclasped the leather ledger she had carried from the glasshouse, setting it gently on the table beside the ancient box. The contrast between her mother's meticulous, private accounting and the sovereign's foundational law was stark, yet they were about to intersect. Thomas hovered nervously at the edge of the table, his territorial instincts flaring. Archivists loathed outsiders handling their records, especially unrecognized young women brought in past midnight. He reached out to turn the first heavy charter, intending to manage the documents himself. "Wait," Lyra said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the crisp authority of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She did not reach for the fragile vellum with her bare hands. Instead, she looked up at the elderly archivist, meeting his wary gaze directly. "Do you have a clean, uninked quill, preferably goosebone, with the barbs stripped?" Thomas blinked, his defensive posture faltering in sheer surprise. He looked from her face down to her leather ledger, finally recognizing the pristine condition of her own bindings. Without a single word of complaint, he opened a narrow desk drawer and produced a polished white feather bone, presenting it to her handle first. Lyra accepted the tool with a brief nod. She leaned over the ancient charter, keeping her breathing shallow to avoid disturbing the loose dust on the fragile surface. Using the smooth, rounded bone end of the quill, she carefully lifted the corner of the heavy vellum. She turned the page slowly, allowing the stiff material to fall open without ever letting the natural oils of her skin degrade the centuries-old manuscript. Darius stood on the opposite side of the reading table, his arms crossed casually over his chest. He was not looking at the legal text. His gaze was fixed entirely on her hands, watching the steady, professional precision of her movements with quiet intensity. "The municipal land grant laws from the Second Era," Lyra murmured, tracing the bone handle down the wide margin of the text without making contact with the dried ink. "They differ from modern property law in one crucial aspect regarding inherited collections. My stepfather used a standard commercial forfeiture template when he pledged the library to his creditors." She used the tip of the quill to point toward a dense paragraph of archaic, cramped script near the bottom of the vellum. "Look at the structural requirements listed here, just beneath the royal seal. This charter establishes that objects of cultural heritage, specifically bound ancestral archives, cannot be seized for gambling debts unless the bloodheir provides a secondary, witnessed signature." Thomas leaned in closely, adjusting his spectacles to follow the exact placement of her quill. His initial suspicion had entirely evaporated, replaced by the profound professional respect of one dedicated scholar recognizing another. "She is absolutely correct, Your Grace," Thomas whispered, looking up at the Alpha King with wide eyes. The Thane contract was filed without a secondary witness from the direct bloodline. Under this specific charter, Garrick's forfeiture is mechanically void. Lyra kept her hand perfectly still, the bone quill resting a fraction of an inch above the parchment. She had known the protective law existed somewhere, but seeing it written in the sovereign's own archive made the truth undeniable. Her mother's legacy was not legally lost. It had merely been stolen through a lazy, arrogant administrative lie. Lyra Vance slid the heavy, iron-bound volume of the municipal charters aside, making room on the scarred oak table for her own records. The beeswax candle flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls of the archive room, where thousands of similar documents slept in quiet rows. She moved with deliberate precision. Panic and grief had been left outside in the freezing glasshouse. In this room, surrounded by ink and parchment, she was the daughter of a master archivist. She opened the leather ledger. Its pages were stiff, smelling of dried lavender and old dust, filled with Elena Vance's meticulous, slanting handwriting. The debt contract Garrick Thane presented to the Sovereign Court relies on a standard property transfer clause, Lyra said softly, her voice barely rising above the distant whistling of the winter wind outside the stone walls. She traced a column of figures with a pale ink-stained finger. He claimed the library and the land beneath it were unentailed assets, free to be used as collateral, but he failed to account for the physical anatomy of the original deed. Alpha King Darius Vaughan stood at the edge of the table, an imposing silhouette of dark fabric and quiet authority. He did not interrupt her. He simply watched her hands. Lyra carefully extracted a folded sheet of heavy vellum from a hidden pocket at the back of the leather ledger. The parchment was yellowed at the edges, brittle with age. She picked up the heavy brass candlestick, moving the flame closer. "Hold this edge, please," she requested, treating him not as a terrifying monarch, but as a fellow scholar in a shared investigation. Darius obliged without hesitation. He stepped into her space, moving with that unnerving, silent grace he possessed. He leaned down closely, bracing one hand flat against the mahogany table, while his other hand pinched the corner of the vellum. Their shoulders were close enough that she could feel the ambient heat radiating from his frame. A stark contrast to the drafty chill of the archive. The scent of cedar and rain wrapped around her, steady and grounding. Yet the physical proximity was driven entirely by shared intellectual curiosity, stripped of any coercive edge. Lyra lifted the vellum, positioning it directly between their eyes and the amber halo of the candlelight. "Look," she murmured, pointing to the center of the page. The light illuminated the dense fibers of the old paper, revealing a faint, translucent crest embedded directly into the material. It was a crescent moon intertwined with a sprawling oak branch. "This is the Vance family watermark," she explained, her breath hitching slightly before she forced it into a calm, measured rhythm. It was pressed into the pulp during the paper's creation, nearly a century ago. A royal grant, protected under the old territorial laws. It explicitly forbids the separation of the library contents from the bloodline inheritance. She lowered the parchment carefully, laying it flat over the copy of the forged debt contract. Garrick's contract is written on standard municipal paper. It carries the wax seal of a minor magistrate, but it lacks the embedded crest. Under the sovereign statutes, a bloodline watermark supersedes any later debt claim filed without a direct heir's signature. The contract he signed is legally void. The ambient silence of the archive room deepened, broken only by the soft snoring of Thomas Thorne in his chair near the hearth. Lyra kept her gaze fixed on the illuminated crest, allowing the sheer weight of the legal precedent to settle between them. Garrick had assumed she was just a quiet girl, mourning a pile of dusty books, completely unaware that she had systematically mapped the exact architecture of his ruin. Darius straightened slowly, releasing his hold on the edge of the vellum. He did not immediately offer empty praise or aggressive declarations of vengeance. He existed in the quiet with profound comfort, feeling no compulsion to crowd the air with unnecessary words. He turned his attention from the ancient parchment to the young woman standing beside him. Lyra kept her posture perfectly straight, her hands folded neatly over the closed cover of the leather ledger. She did not fidget. She merely waited for the sovereign to verify her logic. He softly tapped his index and middle fingers against the edge of the mahogany table. The rhythmic, deliberate sound echoed faintly against the stone walls. Darius was a man who understood warfare, but he also understood the intricate, often lethal machinery of his own court. He knew exactly how many highly paid legal counselors, senior scribes, and ambitious lords sat on his advisory council. None of them had flagged the false contract. None of them had bothered to cross-reference the debt claim with the original territorial land grants. The entire bureaucratic apparatus of the capital had simply accepted a fraudulent claim because the man submitting it had a loud voice and a heavy coin purse. And yet, here was a quiet, overlooked stepdaughter, shivering in a borrowed velvet cloak, who had dismantled an entire web of legal corruption with a single candle and a piece of old paper. "They missed it," Darius said, his voice a low, resonant murmur that seemed to vibrate against the heavy oak shelves. It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement of her absolute victory. 3 senior magistrates reviewed that debt transfer yesterday afternoon. They stamped it with the municipal seal. They handed your mother's legacy to a gambler, and they did not notice a thing. Lyra's expression remained composed, though a muscle feathered along her jawline. People rarely look for complicated truths when a simple lie is already on the desk, she replied, her tone completely devoid of self-pity. Garrick paid his bribes. The magistrates saw what they were paid to see. A quiet girl in a peripheral estate does not warrant the effort of a deep archive search. Darius stopped tapping the mahogany wood. The stillness of his hand was somehow more intense than the movement. He looked at her not with pity, nor with the predatory possessiveness typical of a ruling alpha, but with a profound, unshielded respect. He saw the cracked skin on her knuckles from fetching freezing water, the dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights of calculating ruin, and the unbroken steel of her intellect beneath it all. She had not waited for a savior. She had built her own defense, line by line, inside the pages of that ledger. You did not just find an error, Darius noted, his gaze locking onto hers with absolute quiet clarity. You waited. You let him file the claim officially with the sovereign court. You let him commit high fraud against the crown, ensuring that when you exposed the watermark, the penalty would not just be a voided contract. Lyra held his stare, refusing to look away. If I had shown him the watermark at home, he would have simply burned the original deed, she answered, the cold, pragmatic logic of her survival laid bare. I needed him to submit it to a jurisdiction he could not bribe. Darius felt a distinct, quiet awe settle into his chest. She had weaponized his own legal system better than his highest advisors. He reached out, his knuckles brushing briefly, respectfully, against the worn leather cover of her ledger. He chose the wrong jurisdiction, the king promised softly. The leather ledger felt heavier now, weighted not just by memory, but by jurisprudence. Lyra flipped past her mother's meticulous catalogue of first editions, stopping at the dense administrative appendices, tucked into the very back cover. The paper here was different from the rest of the book. It was stiff with old sizing, brittle at the edges, and covered in a tight, highly disciplined script. Section 4, paragraph 9, Lyra said quietly. She pressed her index finger flat beneath a line of faded iron gall ink. Thomas Thorne leaned heavily over the oak table. The elderly archivist squinted through his brass-rimmed spectacles, his breathing a faint, rhythmic wheeze in the quiet room. He adjusted the angle of the beeswax candle, bringing the warm amber light closer to the aged parchment. Lyra read the text aloud, her voice steady in the cold air. Any structure housing ancestral records, blood tied to a recognized maternal lineage, is permanently exempt from secondary, collateral seizure. It cannot be leveraged against commercial debt without the direct, witnessed signature of the reigning sovereign. Garrick Thane did not have the king's signature. He had bypassed the protection entirely. Thomas turned away from the table and walked toward the deepest shadows of the room. He pulled a massive iron-clasped territorial census from a lower shelf, hauling it back to the light with a heavy grunt. He dropped it onto the table. The impact sent a small cloud of dry dust spiraling into the candlelight, carrying the distinct scent of decaying glue and old parchment. His ink-stained fingers rapidly turned the heavy pages until he found the capital's commercial zoning records for the current year. He reclassified it, Thomas whispered, his voice catching in his throat. Lyra leaned forward, reading the entry he pointed to. Garrick had filed the library under municipal storage. He had quietly stripped the ancestral designation from the registry to erase the sovereign's exemption. He didn't just forge a debt transfer, Thomas continued, his hands trembling slightly with indignation. He falsified the royal census. He erased your mother's lineage from the municipal grid just so he could sell the foundation to his creditors. The sheer scale of the deception settled over the room like dropping temperature. Garrick had manipulated the bedrock of the Pack's legal registry, risking treason charges, entirely to cover his reckless wagers. Thomas muttered an old archivist's oath under his breath. It was a sharp, guttural curse invoking rot upon the hands of those who defiled written truth, a sound of pure, unadulterated professional disgust. Darius stood motionless on the opposite side of the table. He did not express loud outrage. He did not pace the room or raise his voice. He simply looked down at the leather ledger, calculating the exact legal consequences of a forged census entry. The penalty for tampering with the sovereign registry was absolute. His silence was a terrifying, measured thing. Darius turned away from the table and walked toward a reinforced iron cabinet set into the far wall. His footsteps were completely silent against the stone floor, a stark contrast to his imposing physical presence. He unlocked the heavy doors and withdrew a fresh sheet of thick sovereign parchment, an iron-nibbed quill, and a glass vial of uncut black ink. He returned to the table and set the items down. He did not place them in front of himself. He placed them directly in front of Lyra. "The council will convene at dawn," Darius said. His voice was low, carrying the calm authority of a man who held the entire machinery of the state at his disposal. Lyra looked at the blank parchment. She expected him to draft the order. That was how power functioned in the capital. Kings commanded the narrative. Subjects accepted whatever version of justice was handed down to them. "Sit," Darius instructed gently, gesturing to the heavy wooden chair at the head of the table. She hesitated, her fingertips brushing the worn cover of her mother's ledger. "You are the sovereign. The order must come from your hand." "The authority is mine. The inheritance is yours," Darius replied. He took a deliberate step backward, leaving the physical space around the chair entirely to her. "I will not speak for you. You will dictate the exact wording of the reclamation. I will act as your scribe." The implication of his words pressed deep into her chest. He was not offering a simple rescue. He was offering the mechanism of the state and insisting she be the one to wield it. It was an act of profound, radical respect. Lyra sat down. She did not tremble. She placed her hands flat on either side of the blank parchment, feeling the rough, unyielding texture of the paper under her palms. She took a slow, measured breath, letting the cold air of the archive steady her pulse. "Begin with the restoration of the ancestral title," Lyra said, her voice clear and unbroken in the quiet room. Darius dipped the quill into the ink. The sharp scratching of iron against parchment began. She dictated the terms with flawless administrative precision. She cited the original municipal statutes, nullified the forged commercial classification, and explicitly revoked her stepfather's legal rights to any property bearing the Vance family name. She meticulously listed the assets to be protected: the mahogany shelves, the first edition binding presses, the iron-wrought gates. She left no loopholes, no vague phrasing that a clever counselor might exploit in the future. Darius wrote without interruption. He did not question her legal phrasing or attempt to soften the absolute nature of her demands. He simply documented her will, his handwriting sharp and authoritative. When the final sentence was inscribed, Darius set the quill aside. He retrieved a stick of crimson sealing wax from his coat pocket and held it over the flame of the beeswax candle. The rich scent of melting pine resin and hot copper immediately filled the space. He let the thick, dark red wax pool heavily at the bottom of the formal decree. Without a word, he pressed his heavy sovereign ring into the center of the cooling seal. The impression left a flawless rendering of a crowned wolf over crossed swords. The document was complete. It was no longer a grievance. It was law. Dawn came grey and cold over Vaughan Fortress. The pale winter light bled through the high, narrow glass panes of the royal council chamber, offering a bleak, shadowless illumination that was entirely lacking in warmth. Frost clung heavily to the iron brackets of the unlit wall sconces, tracing intricate, silver-laced patterns against the ancient stone masonry. The sheer scale of the room was designed to diminish anyone who stood within it. At the far end of the immense polished oak table, Lyra sat perfectly still. She kept her spine strictly aligned, her hands resting quietly on the dark, reflective wood, listening to the distant, rhythmic tolling of the courtyard bells marking the hour. Exactly 12 minutes after the final bell ceased its ringing, the heavy double doors at the entrance were thrown open with a violent, uncoordinated heave. Garrick Thane stumbled across the threshold, his scuffed leather boots scraping loudly against the pristine granite floor. He did not walk with the measured, dignified grace of a nobleman entering a sovereign court. He swaggered with the aggressive, unsteady momentum of a man desperate to project, a confidence he categorically did not possess. The gambler's velvet doublet was only half buttoned, the rich emerald fabric heavily wrinkled and stained in a manner that suggested he had spent the night slumped across a sticky tavern table rather than sleeping in a proper bed. As he stepped further into the cavernous room, the sharp, acrid scent of stale wine and cheap burnt tobacco rolled off his shoulders. The foul odor immediately clashed with the refined beeswax and cedar resin that naturally perfumed the royal space, marking him instantly as an intruder in a world built on discipline. He cleared his throat, producing a harsh, grating noise meant to demand immediate attention, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the sheer architectural mass of the vaulted ceiling. Lyra watched from her periphery as a dark red flush crept up his thick neck. She noted the frantic way his eyes darted from the towering stone columns to the silent guards positioned at the doorways, his mind instinctively mapping the exits out of pure survival habit. He was a man who treated heritage as expendable currency, playing reckless games of chance with legacies he had not earned, and now that recklessness was catching up to him. "You summoned me, Your Grace," Garrick declared, pitching his voice high and unnaturally loud to mask the sharp edge of panic threading through his shallow breaths. He attempted a deep, theatrical bow toward the head of the table, nearly losing his balance as his heel caught awkwardly on an uneven groove in the floorboards. He recovered with a jerky motion, plastering a false smile across his face. "Though I must admit, the hour is unusually bleak for mundane administrative affairs. A simple courier could have easily delivered my finalized property papers." The Alpha King wielded the deep quiet of the room as an extension of his authority, perfectly at ease in the heavy stillness. He sat at the head of the table, his broad shoulders resting against the high back of his chair. The sovereign watched the unkempt man unravel under the weight of his unblinking stare, using his stillness as a tactical weapon. The king's refusal to speak forced the older man to fill the mounting pressure of the void with even more frantic, defensive noise. Finding no verbal response to anchor himself against, Garrick puffed out his chest, stepping forward to slap a rolled, heavily stamped parchment against the dark wood of the council table. The sharp crack echoed through the chamber. "I assume this urgent gathering concerns the final transfer of the Vance estate," he said, his tone dripping with practiced, greasy smugness. "The wagers are settled. The collateral is mine by absolute legal right, recognized by the municipal registries. The library, the grounds, the entire holding. It belongs to me as of sunrise, signed and witnessed by your own clerks." It was only after delivering his ultimatum that he turned his head, finally noticing his stepdaughter sitting quietly in the periphery of the king's shadow. Lyra did not shrink back into her chair. She did not lower her chin. She kept her fingers resting lightly on the surface of her mother's leather ledger, feeling the familiar worn grain of the binding ground her to the present moment. The thick book sat on the table like a physical anchor. holding the undeniable truth of her family's lineage securely within its pages. Garrick leaned heavily over the table, planting his knuckles against the polished wood, attempting to fix her with the same bullying, predatory glare he used to intimidate desperate creditors and frightened servants in the lower wards. He expected her to immediately look away. He anticipated the usual flinch, the fearful downward cast of her eyes, the silent physical surrender that had always allowed him to control the oxygen in whatever room they occupied together. Lyra merely looked at him. She did not narrow her eyes, nor did she tighten her jaw in a display of anger. Instead, she offered him the exact same measured, clinical gaze she utilized when locating a fatal mathematical discrepancy on a page of financial records. Her silence was not a sign of submission. It was an active, heavy pressure that entirely rejected his authority. She analyzed posture the way she would analyze a fraudulent signature, letting him see that she was entirely unafraid. The older man's arrogant sneer faltered under the steady, unblinking weight of her observation. A single bead of cold sweat formed at his temple, catching the pale morning light despite the freezing ambient temperature of the hall. He shifted his weight nervously from his left boot to his right, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as his posture lost its aggressive forward tilt. The bravado he had carried into the room began to dissolve rapidly. Without realizing what his own body was doing, Garrick's right hand dropped abruptly from the tabletop. His fingers twitched violently toward his empty pocket, scratching frantically at the velvet fabric. It was the exact physical tell he always displayed, right before folding a spectacularly losing hand of cards. Lyra let out a slow, silent breath through her nose, feeling the absolute certainty of his impending legal defeat settle firmly into the cold stone of the room. The council chamber was built for intimidation, its vaulted ceilings designed to swallow the warmth of human breath. Tall windows let in the pale light of the northern dawn, casting long shadows across the oak table where the royal councillors sat in stiff ranks. Lyra Vance stood quietly near the outer edge of the witness circle. She kept her spine perfectly straight, her hands clasped lightly over the coarse fabric of her skirt, letting the silence settle into her bones. She kept her gaze fixed on the center of the table, watching the dust motes drift through the frigid air. He did not answer Garrick Thane's loud demands with a threat. Instead, the Alpha King slowly extended his arm and picked up the thick, weather-beaten book resting near his elbow. The leather ledger felt substantial in his grip, its worn edges a testament to years of meticulous, quiet labor. He lifted it just high enough for the entire room to note its presence, then let it fall. The heavy volume struck the polished oak surface with a dull, final thud. The sound was not deafening, but in the tense quiet of the chamber, it cracked like a breaking branch under winter ice. Her stepfather's mouth snapped shut, the man's bravado derailed by the physical weight of the evidence dropping before him. Darius leaned forward, his movements unhurried. He opened the ledger to the center pages, where the delicate parchment of the original watermarked deed lay flattened against the binding. You claim authority over the Vance estate through a contract of forfeiture, the king said, his voice a low murmur that reached every corner of the vast room. You submitted a signed copy to the municipal clerk 3 days ago. Darius slid the authentic document across the table. However, the true deed, sealed by my grandfather's own hand, bears the sovereign watermarks of the Winter Fortress. Yours does not. Garrick stared at the parchment, his ruddy complexion draining to a sickly grey. He opened his mouth, but the prepared legal arguments withered before they could find sound. The older council members leaned in, adjusting their spectacles to inspect the faint crest embedded within the paper fibers. The physical proof was absolute. It was an undeniable administrative truth, preserved in dry ink and aged parchment. A gambling wager does not override a royal land grant, Darius continued, his tone devoid of anger. The contract you submitted is a forgery. The collateral you attempted to seize never belonged to you. Lyra watched the older man's hands begin to tremble against the edge of the table. He gripped the wood tightly, trying to anchor himself in a room that was shifting beneath his feet. She felt the peace that comes not from revenge, but from the simple restoration of order. The lies that had governed her life were being dismantled with quiet precision, reduced to worthless scraps of paper under the sovereign's steady gaze. With the forged contract invalidated by the Assembly, the remaining bureaucratic procedures shifted into a state of hushed motion. The royal clerk brought forward a fresh sheet of official parchment, the material crisp under the ambient grey light. The young woman watched as the scribe quickly copied the terms of the new ruling, her eyes tracking the scratch of the quill. Every stroke of black ink anchored her mother's legacy back into the bedrock of the Pact's history. It was a formal decree of restoration, returning the ancestral library and officially appointing Lyra to the protected status of royal archivist. Darius waited patiently until the clerk stepped back, leaving the completed document resting in the center of the table. The Alpha King reached for the small iron stand, holding a shallow brass spoon above a steady spirit flame. The sharp scent of melting crimson wax began to curl through the stale air of the chamber. She observed the deliberate care with which the ruler managed the mundane task. He did not delegate the final step. He held the spoon steady, his dark eyes focused entirely on the small, bubbling pool of liquid resin. He tipped the brass spoon, allowing a thick drop of red wax to fall onto the bottom edge of the parchment. It pooled against the dry paper, a vivid splash of color in the monochrome room. The sovereign removed the heavy silver ring from his right index finger. He pressed the deeply engraved metal into the cooling wax, holding it there for a long breath to ensure the seal would not fracture. When he lifted the ring, the royal crest of the Winter Fortress remained permanently embedded in the crimson disk. Darius lowered his head slightly and blew a gentle, measured stream of cool air over the hot wax to set the seal. As the seal cured, the harsh formality of the ruler eased, just for a fraction of a second. A faint softening appeared around the corners of his dark eyes, a subtle shift in the geometry of his face that what else in the room possessed the vantage point to catch. It was a private communication transmitted through the public medium of absolute law. He did not demand a smile of gratitude, nor did he expect her to bow. He merely offered the completed document as proof that the boundaries they had discussed in the garden were real. Lyra let out a slow, barely perceptible breath, feeling the tension uncoil from the tight muscles of her shoulders. The formal decree lay between them, bearing the weight of the sovereign's protection. The cold stone floor beneath her boots felt solid for the first time in years. The ink was dry, the wax was set, and the law of the keep now stood firmly on her side. The council chamber was utterly silent, save for the faint crackle of the hearth fire and the sharp scent of cooling crimson wax. The formal decree lay flat against the heavy oak table, its ink dry and its judgment absolute. Garrick Thane stared at the parchment as if the elegant script had physically struck him. The bluster that had carried him through decades of unpaid wages and stolen inheritances evaporated in the span of a single breath. He did not shout. He did not demand a secondary review. The sheer weight of the sovereign law pressed the remaining air from his lungs. It was not a violent defeat, but a bureaucratic execution, clean, precise, and entirely inescapable. Two royal guards stepped out from the periphery of the room, their chainmail clinking softly against padded wool. They positioned themselves on either side of the older man, waiting for a command that did not need to be spoken. Lyra Vance remained quietly seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap over the cover of her leather ledger. She felt no sudden rush of vindictive triumph, No urge to stand and hurl insults at the man who had stolen her home. The only sensation blooming in her chest was a profound, bone-deep fatigue. She kept her posture perfectly straight, though her spine ached from hours of vigilant restraint, and watched him turn toward the heavy, iron-bound doors. His steps were uneven. The gambler's polished leather boots dragged slightly across the cold stone floor, heels catching on the rough mortar, as if his own body had forgotten how to bear its weight. The newly appointed archivist observed the slump of his shoulders and the sudden greyness of his complexion, realizing with quiet clarity how very small her tormentor truly was. For years his shadow had loomed over her mother's legacy like an inescapable storm. Now, stripped of his fraudulent leverage and exposed by the very municipal land grant laws he had ignored, he was merely a tired, ruined man walking toward an exile he had entirely earned. The sound of his boots faded down the corridor, leaving an atmosphere that felt entirely different from the suffocating rooms she was used to. This was not the silence of endurance. It was the stillness of a resolved equation. Thomas Thorne offered a slow, deliberate nod of approval, tapping his ink-stained fingers against his own ledgers in silent camaraderie. The rest of the councillors began to shuffle their documents, murmuring in low voices as they moved to the next matter of state. No one looked at the young woman with pity anymore. They looked at her with the cautious geometry of respect, adjusting their postures to acknowledge a mind that had navigated the highest legal currents without raising her voice. Lyra let out a slow, measured breath, letting that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack. The morning sun had breached the high walls of the winter fortress by the time she stepped out into the courtyard. The air was still biting, carrying the sharp scent of ozone and crushed pine needles, but the grey gloom of dawn had burned away into a brilliant, cloudless winter sky. Lyra walked along the cleared cobblestone path toward the eastern wing, her steps steady and unhurried. She was no longer hiding in the shadows of the cypress trees. She did not need to press herself against the freezing walls to avoid the gaze of passing sentries or malicious servants. The massive estate belonged to the pack leadership, but her permanent place within it was now a matter of documented law, signed and sealed by the sovereign himself. She followed the familiar curve of the path until the skeletal frame of the royal glasshouse came into view. In the harsh daylight, the shattered panes of glass looked less like delicate silver lace and more like broken fragments of a forgotten era, a ruin that no longer needed to serve as her only refuge. The thick frost was beginning to melt along the rusted iron frames, dripping onto the dormant soil below with a quiet patter that sounded like a ticking clock. Lyra stopped a few paces from the ruined entrance, her hand reaching deep into the pocket of her woolen skirt. Her cold fingers found the heavy shape of her mother's brass key. It was tarnished and old, but it represented the true inheritance she had just reclaimed, the ancestral library. The slow, deliberate crunch of boots on the gravel drew her attention, though she did not shrink away. Darius Vaughan approached with the unhurried grace of a man who owned the earth he walked upon. His heavy velvet cloak shifted with each step, carrying the faint, grounding scent of cedar and winter rain. He stopped beside her, leaving a respectful span of distance between their shoulders so she would not feel cornered. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the frost melt from the ruins, anchored by the unyielding weight of the truth they had secured.